My guest today is Benjamin Till. Born and raised in the Midlands, Benjamin is a Jewish composer, director, and filmmaker. Growing up, he attended the Northamptonshire Music and Performing Arts Trust, following which he studied music and composition at the University of York. He is currently the composer in residence for Mosaic Voices, a vocal ensemble at the New West End Synagogue. Benjamin's music has been performed at top venues, including the Royal Albert Hall, and his new project, The Jews of Britain, sees him looking at the history of Britain's Jews. Benjamin, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Very well. Melting in all this heat, but yeah,
Yes.
apart from that, doing very well.
You and me both. It's really a thrill to have you on here. We haven't really had a chance to speak on the podcast that much about music from a composer's point of view. And I'd be really interested to ask you first of all, from your perspective, what role do you think music plays in Jewish life?
Well, I mean, music is pretty much central to Jewish life. I think. I mean, if you look at the way that a synagogue service is through sung, this is something that non-Jewish people can't actually ever get their heads around. That when I explain that the only things that are spoken in my synagogue are the prayer for the royal family and the sermon, everything else is sung. That every single passage of the Bible, of the Torah or the Bible, has its own melody attached to it. I mean that is fundamental, and I think that all Jewish cultures, whether they are Mizrahi, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, they all have their own very strong musical traditions. And I do think that is very, very different to many other cultures. Um, I also think many Jewish people sing, and they get used to singing as well. And I think that's why, for example, it's the same with the Welsh. The Welsh sing a lot, and therefore Welsh people tend to have better voices because they're just flexing their vocal muscles. And I think that with Jewish people as well. So yeah, I think it's absolutely central to Jewish culture.
Yeah. I mean, I still remember as a child many of the prayers that were sung in synagogue, and they're just embedded in me. And I will still fiercely debate the best Adon Olam tune. I think everyone has their own favorite.
Yeah.
Um, it really is, as you say, a core part of our culture. And I'd be interested to know, growing up as a child, what sort of music did you enjoy? What inspired you?
Well, I didn't know I was Jewish um, when I was growing up.
Really?
So this is quite an interesting question for me. I grew up in the Midlands. My family history is my mother's mother came from a Sephardi Jewish family who migrated from the name Saban to the name Sibon. Um, and growing up, it just wasn't. My grandmother had made the decision that she was no longer part of that world. Um, you can you can see why, because she got married in 1936. That was the year that Mosley was marching through the East End of London. There was a great deal of uncertainty, particularly for Jewish people in Britain. And I think she felt, her family were, as many Sephardi families were already, very secular and not, um, and I think she just thought, I don't need this extra burden. And I think she saw it as a burden. And she moved to the Midlands. She married a non-Jewish man, um, and took up life as the person that she wanted to be. She wanted to go to the local golf club.
Mm.
She wanted to be the queen of the local golf club. She wouldn't have been able to do that as a Jewish woman. So I I understand entirely why she did it. I'm also incredibly grateful to her for giving me that gift, um, for giving me the gift of Jewishness. When I grew up, before I knew anything about my Jewish history, I had myself, I was very, very frightened of Christianity. I found it, and I grew up in essentially an entirely non-religious household. Whenever I walked into a church, I felt incredibly uncomfortable, and so I had myself removed from assemblies at school for religious reasons. And I used to sit in my school library and read books about Judaism.
Mm.
And then my earliest compositions as a child was a book of Jewish dances named after my favorite Jewish festivals. And the curious thing is, I look back at them now, and in fact, I resurrected one of the melodies for the Psalms project I've just worked on. I was kind of weirdly getting it right. And now I understand so much more about Jewish modes and tropes. And weirdly, I was nailing them as a 11-year-old who really had no relationship with Jewishness. I didn't know a Jewish person apart from my family who didn't know either. So it was a closely guarded secret, and then I was mentored for a lot of my life, my early career, by Arnold Wesker, the playwright, and we wrote musicals together. And he used to introduce me to all these old ladies who he thought might give us some funding. He said, "I met this amazing new Jewish composer," and I used to say to him, "Arnold, yeah, I don't think I'm Jewish." And he used to say, "Of course you are." And so, yeah, there was a kind of a fascination, and I was drawn perpetually to Jewish people, and Jewish people were often drawn to me. Um, and it was only really, I knew I had Jewish blood. Yeah, my grandmother used to talk about her relatives were costumers, and she would often reference them, and they were all based in London. Um, but I suppose part of it was that I didn't know about the maternal line
Mm.
and things like that, and I kind of figured that if it had lain dormant for a number of generations, that it didn't count.
Right.
And it was only when I met, purely by chance, Michael Etherton, who runs UK Jewish Film as chief exec and also conducts Mosaic Voices, that he said to me, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, "Yeah, Jewish." Um, and then he said, "Well, why don't you come and sing for Mosaic Voices?" And that was the turning point. I walked into the synagogue, and I felt, for the first time in my life at New West End Synagogue, I felt this sense of absolute calm and peace. And I
Mm.
realized that what was happening was I was walking into a space which wasn't covered in images of death. And that actually, my childhood experiences of walking into churches were walking into a space where there was a man hanging in agony, images of him all over the windows and all over the walls. And I walked into New West End Synagogue, and there were pictures of fruit and flowers and life, and that to me was the turning point. Alongside the fact that we sang the Et Chaim He, and a man stepped forward um, from the congregation. I looked at him and I went, I see where I'm from.
Mm.
I see your face, and I know the tribe that I'm from. He looked like my Uncle Charlie. He looked like my grandmother,
Yeah.
and and that was a very powerful thing. And then a bit of research, and then you realise that there's an unbroken female line, and that I'm in fact the last Jew in my family,
Wow.
and that gives me some weight as a gay man. I'm not going to have children. So I feel now that I have work to do, a lot of work to do in the community.
That's really amazing. I mean, so you came to sort of fully embrace your Jewish identity fairly late in life.
Yeah, but it was like it made perfect sense,
Yeah.
and it was I think a lot of people potentially would discover that news and be very indifferent to it, or maybe even be a little bit worried by it. But for me, it was the the most glorious gift that I could ever have been given, because of my obsession when I was younger with that particular world, um, and all the way through my life, it's followed me.
Yeah.
So now I feel like I've been I could just get going. So for the last 8 years, I just got going.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly your Jewish identity has played a huge role in your work. I wanna ask you about the Blue Book project. The Blue Book project is a BBC Three initiative supported by Arts Council England. It aims to develop Jewish choral repertoire and bring it to a larger audience. You are one of the four winning composers. Can you tell us more about your submission named the Finchley Kedusha and your involvement with this project more generally?
Well, it's a Mosaic Voices project actually. So my involvement was sort of assured. So we put out tenders for the other three composers um, from this grant we got from the Arts Council. But then I was also then tasked with reimagining, rescoring, retransliterating um, work from the Blue Book. I should probably start by pointing out what the Blue Book is. It's um, it's a book of music which was edited in the late 19th century at the New West End Synagogue. So at the synagogue where I'm now resident composer. Um, it's always been the music synagogue, I suppose. And we sing a lot of music. Everyone knows something from the Blue Book. It's gone all around the world. It's like the Christian hymns, ancient and modern, but it's the Jewish equivalent. Um, and we are custodians at New West End of this selection of something like 300 something pieces of Ashkenazi tradition liturgical music, Jewish music. And we take that incredibly seriously. The only problem was that it was scored back in the day for SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass before, for whatever reason, and don't get me started on this, but that the Orthodox tradition stopped using female vocalists, and it became all male. Um, so a lot of the music just can't be performed anymore. It's written in old Ashkenazi um, Hebrew. So there's a lot of shifting of vowels required, and you can't get a depth singer to do that at sight. This is stuff that you need to know about, which are S's and which are T's, which are O's and which are A's, and all of that. Um, so what I was tasked with was to take many pieces from that original Blue Book and well, I see it as saving them, really, enabling them to be performed in perpetuity by lots of different ensembles. So I scored them all so that they could still be performed by female soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and then also scored others for alto, tenor, baritone, bass, and others for tenor, baritone, bass. So that all different ensembles were covered. Um, Everything was retransliterated into modern Hebrew. Um, the in many cases, I extended the work. It's almost illegible because these Victorians, they loved trying to save space, so they would shove all the words underneath, and there'd be different meters for different verses, and you're standing there as a singer looking at them, going, I can't read that. So we wanted to make them legible, and we wanted to save them for the future, and we wanted to put them all online so that anyone around the world could access them for free
Mm,
and sing them in their own synagogues or in their choirs, and hopefully in choirs. And this has started to happen in non-Jewish choirs who are interested in pieces like Shomer Israel. Not necessarily just from the Blue Book. We expanded it to include modern compositions that I'd written. The unifying thing was that they were all texts that you would use on in Jewish services.
yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Let's talk about your musical piece Psalms, which premiered in in May. Now, this is a piece, it's performed in, I want to get this right, it's performed in Hebrew, Yiddish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Irish, dialects of English, including Polari. Now, first off, I'd like to hear about the project, but also, what is Polari? Because until you mentioned this to me before, I had no idea.
So Polari is a dialect really of English, which was spoken by predominantly by gay men, but also a lot of theatre people. It was a code. Um, it allowed gay men to discuss, certain aspects of life without other people being able to understand what they were saying. It's got a lot. It takes a lot of words from Italian. It takes a lot of words from Cockney rhyming slang. But quite a lot of Polari has sort of found its way into, uh, like Yiddish words, I suppose, have found their way into English. A lot of Polari is found. So the word naff, for example, is a Polari.
Is that right?
Face is ikaf or eek, which is face backwards. Lallies are legs. So yeah, it was made famous, popularized, I suppose, by Kenneth Williams in Round the Horn, with the characters Julian and Sandy who used to talk to each other in Polari. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think to these days, it's not spoken anymore. But you would, definitely going back to my early when I was still at drama school, we would have lecturers who would throw in Polari as they were, so they would go along a line going, instead of saying you stand up, you you go to your knees, you stand up, they go, nada dip, nada dip, nada dip, um, so and there were people who would, still the old hoofers and the old show queens would still speak to each other in Polari. I don't think it happens anymore, really, sadly, because it was a beautiful thing. Um, but there's a little bit of it in the Psalms project in the very beginning, which is the words of Genesis, the opening of Genesis in all the different languages. So it's a bit of a sort of a commotion, lots of noise. But one of the languages in there is Polaria. I think the only way that you can really describe my family is as Anglo-Jewish. We don't have the same stories about immigration and the Holocaust as other families. That we were established here for hundreds of years, as so many of those kind of early Sephardi families were. Um, so I feel very English. I don't know that there are. Well, I feel very British because my father is Welsh. My grandmother um, was first language Welsh speaker. So I still remember, for example, her sitting me down. She used to play the piano, and she used to sit down and sing "The Lord's My Shepherd" in Welsh to me, Psalm 23. And the kind of the genesis, I suppose, of the Psalms project was that when in the very early moments of the corona, the pandemic, my synagogue was terribly affected. It all happened at the Purim, as it happened with many people in the Jewish community. We got absolutely hammered, and we all got ill, and I got ill, and a week before lockdown, I was already ill, and I remember looking out of the window at at, um, at Finchley below me after the lockdown, and thinking, well, I haven't been out for however many days it was by then, and now I'm going to exit this house in an entirely different world, and suddenly the doors of the synagogue closed down, and I wrote to the rabbi and I said, look, I have to do something here. I'm aware that we can keep the community together through music. Um, we've got some recordings, we can recycle those, we can start to make films. I'm a filmmaker, I can help there. And he said, why don't you do a setting of Psalm 23? Because I think that would give people a lot of hope right now. And of course, then you suddenly have this full circle moment where I think, golly, I remember my nan singing to this to me in Welsh, and now I'm setting it in Hebrew, um, and and so we recorded. I wrote this setting of Psalm 23. I recorded it at my mate's house, who left his front door open and a microphone in his upstairs bedroom with a pair of cans. And I walked in, put my kippah on, um, put the headphones on, and sang, and then sang the piece. Then put the headphones away and left the house. And he waved at me through the window, um, and we had a piece of music which we then asked members of the Jewish community to send in their photographs of themselves during lockdown. So we had this kind of pictorial history of lockdown from a Jewish perspective, which we then released on YouTube, so people could see themselves basically during lockdown. And so I suddenly became very aware of the importance of the Psalms, and wanted to write a piece of music which reflected not just the kind of my Jewishness, but also um, my interest in British folk music, which was generated by my nana's Welshness, and growing up in an intensely rural community, I loved folk music, and I thought, what we need at the moment is things that unify communities. And the Psalms, whichever side of the wall you are in Belfast, you still believe in the Psalms, whether you're Catholic or Protestant. If you're Jewish, there are huge musical traditions in the Hebrides based on singing the Psalms. There are Welsh traditions, Penillion, which is a kind of people improvising melodies over the top um, of a kind of an established melody, and that's often done to psalms as well. So I thought, the psalms, they're in Welsh, they're in Scots Gaelic, they're in Irish, they're in Yiddish, they're in Hebrew. Well, let's bring all of those um, elements together. Uh, and for the first time, Mosaic Voices sang with female singers, but we did it in a halachically pure way, because we never actually appear with the women in the things, and we were never there in the studio with them. So we layered up all the different voices, and then each of the singers sings their own modern take on the biblical or Torah words. Um, uh, so you're looking at it from a modern day perspective, and that was the genesis of the film, and it took essentially 3 years to make, and we shot it up and down the country, from Glencoe, and we were in Oxfordshire, and we were in Hadrian's Wall, and in South Wales, and in the beautiful Jewish cemetery in Merthyr Tydfil, and in London, and in Kent.
Yeah.
And it was a beautiful experience. And I'm really proud of the film. We have a female vicar in it, a girl that I actually grew up with back in Northamptonshire.
Wow.
And yeah, and it's sort of, I would say there's a big long passage in Yiddish, and I would say the lingua francas are probably English, Hebrew, and Welsh. Those are the three really big languages involved in the piece. But it was a thrill to make, and I think what was, I suppose, most upsetting about it, or the most, was the fact that we were halfway through filming when the attacks happened.
The October 7th attacks.
October the 7th, yeah.
Right.
And that following morning on the 8th, so I'd gone to shul on the 7th, and it was all happening. And then on the 8th, I woke up, and it was becoming clear quite the extent to what had happened, and I went under a bridge, a local bridge, to pick up my cameraman in the car for a day of filming, and it said "Free Palestine"
Mm.
on the bridge, and someone had painted that overnight, and I felt so profoundly incensed by this, by the fact that I was reading that after, you know, 1,500 of my cousins and brothers and sisters had been so brutally murdered. My new family, and I was actually filming a sequence where I had to sing, and I had to sing Ani Shalom, Chi Adaber. I was singing I'm for I'm for peace, but when people see me, they want war.
Mm.
Um, and um, it was so profoundly upsetting to think that that is exactly, that I decided to sing that text, because I felt very instinctively that that was still the case, and that then the day after 7/10, I was singing these words: "I'm for peace, but when they look at me, they want war."
Mm.
And it was so profoundly difficult to do that with, knowing what had just happened, and seeing the indifference around me, um, seeing my own union, the musicians union, and PRS for Music, who both of whom, PRS for Music, who had sponsored our work, and the Arts Council, who'd sponsored this work, not condemning those attacks
Mm.
at a music festival. And that was the stuff that all of this was going through my mind as we were filming, and it was very, very um, confusing and um, difficult. Um, yeah, it really was. Um, but then, of course, it took on a profundity, the piece, because I believe right now we should all be looking at similarities. We really, really have to do that. And I think in our community, especially, we need to just look for what unites us, um, and don't be frightened. Don't be too scared. Face the outside world and be proud. Um, that's what I wanted the Psalms piece to be. It's about pride. We're fed a diet in the media of dead Jews. That's all we see, or Jews being oppressed. That's the diet we see. It's either Jews being oppressed from outside or from inside. So all the films people want to make are about people trying to escape the Haredi community, or whatever, or pieces about the Holocaust or anti-Semitism. And actually, what I want to see is pieces about British Jewish people, where British Jewish people are saying, we've been here 350 years. This time round, we were here in the Middle Ages.
Mm.
We've now been here for 350 years. That's a hell of a long time to develop amazing traditions, amazing, quirky, eccentric British Jewish traditions, which we need to be celebrating. We need to be screaming from our lungs, at the tops of our lungs, about how beautiful and wonderful this British Jewish community is. And we need to be shouting at the Arts Council and saying, we need to be able to tick a box in our census which allows us to say that we're Jewish, rather than claiming that Jewishness is just a religion. It's not just a religion, and as long as it's just a religion, then the Arts Council won't fund projects about Jewish music, because it's not one of their tick boxes. And these are all the things that we need to be changing at the moment, and we need to be just so proud of ourselves as living. We have to remember that the central philosophy of Judaism is is life. And that's the thing that I if I can leave nothing else when I die, um, to this community that I've become a part of, that
Mm.
the community that I was always a part of but have now embraced, is that let's celebrate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an awesome way of looking at it, and it's an astute point you make, about how the media essentially, loves dead Jews, which is what one of our previous guests said. Dr. Dara Horn, she's written a book, "People Love Dead Jews." She came on the podcast, and her point is that the media, don't really like it when Jews stand up for themselves or successful, but stories about dead Jews or Jews in the Holocaust, basically Jews as victims. Yes, that's what we're about. So to see you creating a project based on, Jewish accomplishments, Jewish pride, Jewish history, yeah, that's a beautiful thing. And that leads me on to asking you about your new project, the Jews of Britain. So this is your newest thing. Now you describe it as a 50-minute work that will be split into 10 movements. It will be scored for mixed voices, strings, percussion, all of that. How did you come up with this idea, and why was this project the thing that you felt, yeah, I got to make this?
So I think it had its roots in a piece I wrote called Time, um, which was after Psalms. They all happened this year, actually. Oddly, sometimes just all your projects land at the
It's
same
been a
time.
busy year for you.
Yeah, no, it really has. So Time was premiered at New West End by Mosaic Voices in January, and it's for 8 voices. And it told the history of the New West End Synagogue um, through newspaper reports in largely in the Jewish Chronicle. Um, and so, I spent weeks and weeks and weeks researching um, the history of New West End, and some amazing stories. The New West End was the synagogue where the suffragettes chained themselves to the railings on Yom Kippur and threw leaflets down to Herbert Samuel below, saying, you know, essentially, God forgive them for treating women like dirt. Um, it's always been this slightly radical synagogue, and that's what I love about being there. Actually, it's a wonderful, it's the friendliest, the warmest community you could ever imagine, and we are still quite radical there. But there were stories about, First World War soldiers, about running tea party for children in bomb shelters in the Second World War. Um, stories about ghosts, stories about Charlie Chaplin, who bizarrely is a relative of mine, visiting um, visiting the shul. And so to tell a sort of 100-year history or more than 150, 170-year history of a synagogue um, in a piece of music, it felt like quite an audacious thing to do, but it was incredibly well received, um, and it allowed people just again to celebrate. It's so important. And I saw people being. We ended with the words that had been written by the secret shul goer, who actually died just very shortly um, before we did the piece. And she was very, very complimentary about New West End, and she loved being there. And she described the choir as being like Il Divo, and it was all. And she said it was the warmth of the space that made, it's a beautiful synagogue, but it was actually the warmth of the people there that made it so magical. So we ended with those words, and it enabled people, my community, to feel proud, um, as the Psalm 23 piece with the photographs of the Jewish community in lockdown had enabled people to feel that we did this. We were doing all these things. We were being nurses, and we were making visors. And we were doing all these amazing things during lockdown. So that for me is really important. And again, I talk about the fact that I feel like a British Jew, and I feel like the British Jewish identity has been obliterated. And I say that, and I just feel strongly that British Jews are looking to Israel and they're looking to America for a sense of their own identity, um, and I think that's ludicrous. because they're looking to the people of a country that isn't even as old as the community in this country for a sense of their Jewishness. It makes no sense to me at all. Um, and I think it was the fact that I don't think I knew that there were Jewish people in the UK in the Middle Ages. I don't think, I don't know when that information filtered into my brain, but it surprised me, and I didn't really know about the expulsion of Jews in 1290. I knew about, well, I went to university in York, so I must have known there were Jewish people because the Clifford's Tower tragedy in 1190 is documented there. Um, but there were 200 years basically from 10, maybe 1080 to 1290, where there were huge community of Jewish people in this country. In some cities, it was as high as sort of 5 or 10%. Winchester, for example. Um, and the interesting thing about those communities is that they were in very different places to where the Jews are now. So they were in Northampton, they were in York, they were in Winchester, Canterbury, obviously some in London as well. Um, and then you start to, when you've been around as many blocks as I have, you start to piece things together. It's like when you move to London and you realise that Leicester Square and Covent Garden are actually really close to one another, but you don't need to get a tube from one to the other.
Yeah.
History becomes like that. My dad's a historian, and when the different, I have these passions for different projects, and when they start to piece themselves together, you realise that you're onto something. And I did a big piece about Samuel Pepys and Pepys's diary um, about sort of 15 years ago, and of course Pepys visited one of the first Jewish synagogues after the Jews were readmitted under Cromwell. In 1662, he goes to um, the first British synagogue, and he writes this really sort of angry piece about he can't believe how badly behaved the Jewish people are, and how they're screaming and shouting and talking through the service. I mean, you can see it, even now. But on um, he was there on Simchat Torah, so he was witnessing something. Um, you know, Slightly different to what normally happens in synagogues. So I'm sure it was uproarious, and he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. But you see those descriptions, and you suddenly realise that there's this wealth of stories about um, British Jewish people. Um, and I think it was the discovery of, there's a piece of graffiti, and nobody seems to be able to tell me whether it still exists or whether um, it was notated, but then the building was destroyed by Cromwell in the Civil War. But there's a piece of graffiti apparently on the wall of Winchester Castle, um, and it says, um, on the night of the day that they read, and it's a passage from Leviticus as a portion, all the Jews in this island were imprisoned. I, Asher, inscribed this. And what I loved about that, it was so pithy and so short that, and he'd written it in 1287, so 3 years before um, the Jews were thrown out of the UK, and he'd written it. I think it was to do with the coin clipping, which was when the whole Jewish community was basically accused of coin clipping, i.e., cutting off little pieces of silver from the coins, at one moment, every single the male of every single Jewish household was thrown into jail. And he'd written it there, so you've got this context. When it was written, what they were reading in shul that morning, and you know that the person who wrote it was a man called Asher. And actually, when you then um, look into it, his Asher's mother was Licoricia, who was this amazing kind of wealthy, kick-ass Jewish woman who knew the king and had made an absolute fortune in Winchester and Oxford. Um, so you start piecing together these incredible stories of Jewishness. And there's all the writings of Arnold Wesker, who'd been my mentor, talking about the Jewish East End, and he gave me a big uh, print of the Battle of Cable Street, which he'd commissioned from a painter called John Allen. Um, and there's a copy in the Jewish Museum actually. And the Battle of Cable Street, that's another amazing British Jewish story. And then there's the Tredegar riots, which was the backdrop for the beautiful film Solomon and Gaynor. And you have all of these stories about British Jewish life from different towns and cities across the different countries of the United Kingdom. Um, and I just thought we need to tell these stories. Um, we really do. We need people to know that this is Britain's oldest immigrant community. We need people to know that how long we've been here, and also that we have our stories to tell. British Jewish people have very specific and amazing stories to tell.
Yeah.
And obviously, I can't tell them in detail. So I have to choose little texts that might be 2 or 3 sentences long that feed into the narrative, the overall narrative, without needing too much explanation, without needing too much context,
Yeah.
so that the words themselves can have emotional impact by anyone listening to the piece without necessarily knowing the context, but they can feel a real sense of a real sense of the Jewishness coming through. Um, and so that's what this research project has been all about.
Yeah, that's a big project. These bits of text, these little stories that you're looking for, you've actually appealed to the public for them to send in their stories for you to
Yeah.
feature in this project. I thought that was very interesting. Why did you decide to make it interactive in that way?
Well, look, I don't. I don't really feel like Of course, a lot of the reason why somebody like me makes films and composes music is because I want to make art. But I want to share art more than I want to make it. I want to write the stuff that people want to hear. There's always that thing where you listen to the last night of the proms and they have the new commission, and it needs to be endured rather than enjoyed. And you get all these people sort of talking about it rather pretentiously, and it has to sound horrible in order to be embraced um, by the musical community. And I loathe all of that because I want people to hear melody, and I want people cry when they hear my music. That's the most important thing for me. I want to know you've cried, because
I need to see the tears.
yeah, I need to see those tears. I'll come around with a bucket, I collect them all, and then I'll wash in them. But I think I think it's really important that you write music that people want to hear, and and so that's that's the central part of the reason why I write, and therefore, if in order to write music that people want to hear, you have to ask people what stories are that you're going to tell.
Mm,
Um, I can't, obviously at a certain point, I'll have to make some decisions about which texts I'm going to use. But I want to, I'm going to be writing all of these up as a big document so that anyone can access them. All the quotes, all of the things, all of the contexts, um, because I think it's really important that we're telling those stories. but also I don't want to find out that there was this amazing diary entry that has never been published yet that I might be able to, share with the world for the first time.
Mm.
That's exciting. A little postcard written by a First World War soldier to their grandmother, um, the night before they died, um, saying, "Don't worry, I'll be all right." Um, that I want to have. I want to see that. I want, and it's amazing the response that I've had from people. Things that I knew this would happen. I knew that people would blindside me with with the things they want to share. Somebody talking about that their father or grandfather had written poems about life in Temple Fortune in the 1950s.
Wow.
Well, as we all know, the telling of Jewish history has to stop at the end of the Second World War because we were rescued from our hell, and that's the end of the story. Lots of us died. End of story. Dead Jews, lovely. But actually, I want to know what happened with those emigres who came to the UK
Yeah.
uh, to escape Nazi Germany. I want to know what happened to them in the 50s and 60s. I want to write about the Cosmo cafe in Swiss Cottage where they all used to go and have one cup of tea that would last them for an entire day, and they'd sit there painting or discussing philosophy, or um, those are the stories which fascinate me. And also digging deeper, I want to know what the first piece of music written by a Jewish person was in Britain. That's my goal with this composition, because I want to quote that melody. Yes, it might be um, Leone who wrote the Yigdal that is still sung, um, which seems to have been written in the 18th century. But only today I discovered that it is likely that there was a female composer who was a conversos, so she was pretending to be not Jewish, living here in the 1630s. So that's 25 years before um, Jewish people were readmitted into the UK officially. That she's living here as a conversos, and it's a female composer who, I mean,
Wow.
this stuff is blowing my mind. This is the stuff that I never ever thought that I would be discovering. Yeah, a female composer who's Jewish, who's living as a conversos in this country. You know, mind officially blown. That is extraordinary. So it's that kind of thing that I'm hoping to find and am finding,
Yeah.
uh, and yeah, hopefully through this project we'll all learn something about our community.
It sounds like an incredibly exciting and passionate project. If people want to get involved, how can they contact you? And is there a deadline for this?
Well, I'm hoping to finish my research by the end of August, by the end of this month. Um, that at a certain point you have to say, okay, enough's enough. I have to write this thing now.
Mm.
And so I shall be intensively researching this for another month. And yeah, they can just email me at benjamin.till@ukjewishfilm.org. Um,
Awesome.
uh, if they have anything that anyone wants to share with me,
Yeah.
I'm up for hearing anything. But I suppose the key thing is just to remember that I have to tell this in a very short, pithy way. So,
Mm.
sort of saying, "Oh, we have this amazing story of my grandmother escaping," blah blah blah. Um, that may be too long to include in the piece. So you're looking for those quotes which feel universal
Sure.
and feel like you can hear three lines and go, "Oh, I feel something."
Mm.
Um, I get a sense of something that feels very universal and very truthful,
Yeah.
and it gives me an emotional connection. Um, so that's just the thing to remember, that and that's why it's quite nice to find these original texts, these
Yeah.
passages, diaries, and letters, and sort of a lot of Jewish people write autobiographies that they don't publish. They just write their stories. That's what I love about Jewish people. They tell their stories. They fill that the written word is really, really important. It's really, really vital to get these stories told.
Mm.
Um, so you'd be surprised at how many autobiographies there are knocking around in people's attics, um, which I'm very interested in passages from them.
That's very cool. That's very cool. Now, I want to ask you about something a bit more serious. You spoke out very recently about how you personally have felt nervous in public as a Jewish person. You detailed two incidents. One incident where someone recently kicked a bottle at you whilst yelling "Free Palestine." In another incident, you said you found yourself, I think maybe you were on the tube or a train, you were surrounded by anti-Israel demonstrators, and you took off your kippah because you were essentially fearing for your safety.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about these experiences and how you've been feeling lately as a Jew in Britain.
Look, it's hard, um, and I'm not the only one who's experienced this stuff. But I'm sure we all have. Yeah, I was at Oxford Circus, and I was wearing my kippah. I'm not a religious man, really, but after 7, 10, I started to wear my kippah because I felt that there was importance in solidarity. And actually, what I should say is for every one of these awful stories, there's a story of hope
Mm.
and a story of joy. But there's 6 stories of hope and 6 stories of joy. From people coming and sitting next to me on the tube and saying, "Look, I feel safer sitting with another Jewish person," to non-Jewish people coming up to me and saying, "Viva Israel," and whatever. It's that's very, very heartening. Um, and also, I do it because I think that it's vital that the non-Jewish community get to see so many different shapes of Jewish people. So when I'm on the tube sitting next to my husband who's got a mohawk and knits, you can see people sometimes, if I'm wearing my kippah, looking a bit confused.
Do they know each other?
Yeah, this is an unusual pairing. But I think that's important because so much of anti-Semitism comes through stereotyping,
Mm.
and the belief that all Jews are this, or all black people are this, or all gay people are this. And the moment that you can start to challenge that, the less ammunition people have to express their anti-Semitism. Um, and the other thing was as well. Look, I am a gay man. I experienced being a gay man in the 1980s at the height of the AIDS pandemic, where there was no hope. Um, I always say that outrage is a form of privilege, and we had no hope in the 80s. We couldn't say, "How dare you treat us like this? How dare this?" Because we would be arrested. Um, people believed that the whole HIV/AIDS thing was our fault. Um, you couldn't you couldn't. I thought that being queer bashed was a rite of passage, and that if I was queer bashed, I wouldn't be able to go to the police because I'd have to admit that I was gay, and that and that there was institutional homophobia in the police forces. I couldn't get married. I couldn't. I couldn't join the army if I wanted to join the army. There was just no rights, and outrage was completely not something that we could express. So that's the context for this, and I spent most of the 80s being terrified that people would know I was gay. So I altered my behavioural patterns. I adopted a voice that I felt didn't sound perhaps as camp as I had maybe naturally been. I would cross the road whenever I saw a gang of men walking. I spent a lot of time in a state of abject fear, and once I came out, I wasn't going back into the closet for anyone, and I feel the same as being Jewish. It's the same. It's exactly the same. We are minority communities which are invisible. People don't necessarily look at us in the street and go, "Oh, that's a Jewish person." I mean, I'm sure some do, or some try to, but what I mean is that you can't. It's not as simplistic as being a minority that people can see. So when you're Jewish, um, and you sit in a changing room in a gym and you hear people talking about Israel, you hear what they really think of Jewish people. Same as being gay. Um, and so the kippah came on as my way of being defiant,
Mm.
because I'm not going back into the closet as a Jewish person either. And that became very, very central to my philosophy. So yeah, I had a broken bottle kicked at me by a man who was chanting "Free Palestine," who followed me along the corridor, and it was frightening. It was really scary, and I thought, okay, it's happening. This is now happening. Um, and it happened to me again in Finchley Central, where somebody shouted "Free Palestine," and I took that person on, and I went up to him and I said, "Why did you shout that at me?" And he said, "Because you're a Zionist." And I said, what do we mean by Zionist? Do you mean, do I believe in the existence of Israel? Well, of course, I believe in the existence of Israel. Do I think that would I like a ceasefire? Yes, of course, I would also like a ceasefire right now. Would I like the hostages to be returned home before there's a ceasefire? Yes. Um, but we're all different. We all have different views. So don't tar me with a brush, and don't make Zionist a bad word. You know, um, first
I
off,
mean, also he didn't. He just saw you had a kippah
yeah,
and it was immediately like Jew equals Zionist.
Zionist, yeah. But also, I hate the way that people that that there is this tendency for people on the far left in this country to justify anti-Semitism by saying, well, people just don't know the difference between a Jewish person and a Zionist, without realizing that nearly all Jewish people are Zionists in some way.
We recently released polling, and in our polling, it found only 6% of Jews did not identify as a Zionist.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with. I'm sure that that's absolutely true. But to be a Zionist is not the same as to agree with everything that happens in Israel, or agree with what's happening in the war at the moment. So, look. Anyway, that's a sort of sideline thing. But the incident at Oxford Circus was scary, um, and the walking into a carriage full of people who were going on a Palestinian march. Um, I'm a very, very bad Jew. I'll confess. I get a tube to New West End. I live in Finchley. I have to go into central London. So I come out of tube. I come out of Shul and I get on a tube and I go home to Finchley. And I tell you, the moment that I get on that Northern line, I do feel this palpable sense of relief, because I'm suddenly with more of my people.
Mm.
But on the Central line, it can be a bit, when there's you're coming out of Shul at 12 o'clock on a 12:30 on a day when there's a march.
Yeah.
That can be hairy. And on one occasion, I stepped into the tube and I suddenly thought, oh, okay,
Mm.
yeah, here we are. Here's the situation. I'm wearing a kippah and I'm surrounded by people wearing keffiyeh and, um, and holding placards, and I don't like this. Um, and it was crowded as well. It was very, very, very claustrophobic, and I lasted about two stations, and then I just removed my kippah, um, and I held it in my hand. And the woman next to me was wearing a black woman. She was wearing a badge that said "unapologetically black." And I thought, I am now holding my kippah like it's some kind of dirty secret. And it made me feel such a sense of shame that I burst into tears and I stood for 2 more stops crying. Not a single person in that carriage offered me any support or asked if I was okay. And for the first time in my life, often when you're crying, you just don't want anyone to notice you. But for the first time in my life, I wanted somebody to ask me if I was okay. I really did. That made me feel very, very sad. And I got out at Tottenham Court Road, and I actually got out of the tube because I needed to get some air. But that was the low point. That was in November, I think. And then at the end of that month, we had the UK Jewish Film Festival, and that was horrific because we were in cinemas behind closed shutters. We were pretending that we didn't exist. And God knows this year, very few cinemas seem to want us.
Mm.
And we're hearing lots of excuses as to why we can't perform. Well, we can't put films in Northampton or whatever. But anyway, yeah, that was upsetting. But we had commissioned that year, as we do each year with the Film Hub, five short doc films and 2 pairs short film funds, which are all about British Jewish life. And we happen to have had two films from Leeds that year, one from Liverpool. And at the end of that month, I went up to Leeds. I did a tour. I toured the films and did Q&As after the films in Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester. And I sat in cinemas with people who needed to be in that space together as the Jewish community. And I was able to show them films about their community. So we had a film about the anti-Semitic attacks that had happened after the Sergeant's Affair in 1947 in Liverpool. And there were people in that room who'd remembered those attacks and remembered the feelings and were able in the Q&A afterwards to share their experiences and to talk about how it felt. And other films which were just about the pride in those communities, and people were able to laugh and feel, just proud.
Mm.
And it was the biggest turning point for me because I realized that actually I had allowed myself to be put into this space where I was so ashamed of wearing a kippah that I was crying. To a space suddenly where I realized that what I needed to do was be as proud and as obviously Jewish as I could be. And I've never really looked back. And yeah, of course, there have been other incidences which have enraged me and made me feel very frightened. We've had a couple of bomb threats in the synagogue, and a couple of times when we've all been herded into a room while the security have tried to deal with somebody trying to come in. So all that stuff has happened, but I now feel like a very much stronger person who can deal with all of that.
Yeah.
And deal with it with pride, and a feeling of deep gratitude to my grandmother, really, for allowing me to be Jewish.
Yeah. I think that's great, and I'm very sorry to hear about these experiences. I'm pleased that you're coming out on the other end stronger than before. I think a lot of people are gonna listen to what you've just said and wonder what they can do. And this sort of nicely segues into a question that I ask all of my guests, which is, if someone who is not Jewish comes to you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
Well, I think firstly you've got to encourage those people who are not Jewish to come to you. And so I think we all have a task there to be outward looking, um, in a way that perhaps we're not at the moment. And I understand entirely why. And I understand it's much easier for me to be outward looking because I have no other choice with a non-Jewish father. Um, I have a foot in both worlds. Um, but I do think that um, we need to face outwards, and we need to. Another reason I wear this is because it makes me behave better when I'm on the tube. I'm not going to tell someone to f off if I'm wearing this. It would be
It
awful.
keeps you in check.
It keeps me in check. It makes me a nicer person because
Yeah.
I don't want anyone to go, oh, bloody hell, they're rude, aren't they? So what was? Look, it's really interesting. I had this. I'm constantly having revelations about stuff, and I think 99.9% of people are not genuinely not anti-Semitic. I think they say things by mistake, which make them seem maybe like that, or if we interpret them in a way that is anti-Semitic. I think uh, it's so hard because I think that one of the issues I have, and this is the thing I told my union, um, was that it's not okay to clump anti-Semitism in with racism and Islamophobia in this particular climate. To clump them all in and to say that they're all the same thing is inherently problematic. And I think if I could say anything to non-Jewish people at the moment, it's just don't lump it all into one thing. We don't need to say, we don't need to list all the things that are bad in the world. We just don't need to do that. We can say we don't support anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is bad, and end the sentence there. We don't need to pile it in with a load of other things that make us feel good or that feel like a virtue signal. We don't need to do that. We can just say anti-Semitism is bad and end it there, and then Jewish people won't feel like you don't mean it.
Mm.
And that is the one thing I would probably say, the one piece of advice.
Mm. Benjamin, I know you've spoken a lot about your projects throughout this podcast, but before you go, please remind the listeners, what have you got going on? What have you got coming up? And where can people find you?
So I think Mosaic Voices, mosaicvoices.co.uk, and all the information is there about what Mosaic Voices are doing at New West End Synagogue. And if they want to find out about the UK Jewish Film Festival, then ukjewishfilm.org. And that's where we are. We have a festival coming up in 2 months' time, November. We have five short docs that they can watch, 2 pairs films, one starring Maureen Lipman, the other starring Tracy Ann Oberman, and amazing films this year. And actually, I think it's more important this year than any other year, including last year, to really, really start to cross-pollinate with our Jewish culture, and to support as much as we can the organizations who are trying to do things, because we're all dealing with a lot of rubbish at the moment, from UK Jewish, from not being able to find venues or to be given really rubbishy slots in venues. We're trying our very hardest, but there is no money around, and so come and watch the films, come and support what Mosaic Voices is doing. Come along to a service at New West End. We're there every Saturday. Mosaic Voices every week as a choral service. So yeah, come and support us. But support as many Jewish charities, organisations, particularly creative ones, as you can.
All right. Benjamin Till, I really want to thank you very much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism. I had a good time.
My pleasure. Me too. Thank you.